Welcome, everybody, to the Windfall Reading Series, the last one of this season. So we always take a break in the summertime, and this is the last live streamed one we're going to have that's solely on our platform of StreamYard. My name's Wendy. I work at the Eugene Public Library, and I'm thrilled that you could all be here either tonight on this beautiful spring day, or later on if you're watching this wonderful reading again or for the first time. So welcome. This is also the last time we're going to have our fantastic hosts from the Lane Literary Guild, Amanda and Diane, and they've done such a spectacular job. So a million thanks to them and their fine work and their warm introductions and just everything about them. So thank you so much for all you've done for the Windfall Reading Series. Also, thank you to the Lane Literary Guild for all they've done with the series and also with writing overtime across different, not just in Lane County, but outside Lane County as well. I also wanted to give some big thanks to a couple of groups for the Eugene Public Library, the Friends of the Eugene Public Library and the Eugene Public Library Foundation. Both groups fundraise tirelessly. They support us in a number of different ways. We just had a massive book sale, our huge book sale that's always a success in April with the Friends, and raised a lot of money to help support the library. It's always just such a delight to work with them, and we are so thankful that they can help us have programs like this and other things besides with Eugene Public Library. So many thanks to you and to all their authors and the readers and the people involved with the Windfall Reading Series. We have two authors this evening. As is the case, and will be the case when we go live on site in September, we will also have a streaming component so you can still watch from the comfort of your home. You are welcome to respond to the reading with questions or comments or thoughts, and there are a couple of different ways you can do that. You're welcome to write your comment or your question just below the video here on YouTube, and we will read it at the end of the readings. You're also welcome to go to my email page. Let me get to that. You can email me as soon as I find it. There I am. You're welcome to email me at this address, and I will read your question or comment at the end of the reading. You can use your own name, you can use a pen name, you can use your pet's name, whatever you want to do. So do feel free to ask anything that's on your mind or make a comment that you'd like to have us read at the end. Yeah, so that's me. I'm going to now bring up Amanda and Diane for their ultimate introduction, and here they are.
Thank you, Wendy. Yes. Tonight, Diane and I wrap up our work on Windfall. Wow. We give huge, as we say in Eugene, thanks to the amazing writers we heard from this year, to the library, especially our host, Wendy, and Laura, our media mogul, and to you, writers and friends from local and planetary writers communities. You can still hear all this again. It remains up on the library website, well, on the library YouTube channel. And Windfall continues in September in person and also online, coordinated by Joan Dobby and Erica Gross. So stay tuned. Now, our two authors will read for 25 minutes each, with, as we said, time for your comments or questions after, so please stay on. There's much to talk about. First, Chloe Garcia Roberts is not easy to introduce briefly. Poet, translator, and essayist, she lives and works in subtlety, in between the lines, but also in Boston, Massachusetts. Her poetry book is The Reveal, and her essays appear in many places, including Lyric Essay as Resistance, both great titles. Tonight she reads renderings, creative translations from The True History, a complex 16th century narrative about the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. Chloe.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here back in Eugene, even if only through the internet. So tonight I am going to read you a few renderings from the Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España, the true history of the conquest of New Spain, translated in poetic form. The account was written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who served under Cortés, and is a canonical text that has wielded unparalleled influence on the representation and understanding of Mexican history and identity for centuries. Dubbed the first great American novel, it has become, for better or worse, part of the bedrock of Mexican consciousness, a supertext along the lines of the Bible or the Odyssey. The story, Bernal writes, of the Spaniards landing in Veracruz, their inland travel through Mexico, their entry into the capital at the heart of the Aztec Empire, and the subsequent fall of that empire and the establishment of another, is echoed in the language and form that Diaz uses to record his story as terms from the Nahuatl or other languages of the place blend with Homeric narrative structures, Aztec concepts appropriated by the Spanish, biblical references, theological and mythological references, political alignments, machinations and prejudices, varieties of Spanish, etc. The language that composes this text is itself an encounter narrative. The Historia Verdadera was published in Spain in 1632 after being heavily edited to favor the interests of the Spaniards. The original codex was then lost until the early 20th century, when my great-grandfather, Homero García, obtained a copy of this original manuscript and published it in 1904. This edition, known as the Guatemala manuscript, became, in a way, the true history. In family lore, my great-grandfather is always referred to first and foremost as a famous translator and historian. But in terms of this text, what he was a restorer. He had a revision. Since the book is an account of the author reliving a particular moment in time, it reads like a present tense trapped in amber. Rendering it in English, I wanted to play with creating a form that also exists in the present, like a translation draft, a form that prioritizes possibility over choice and which gestures at the complexities of another type of encounter between a text and its reader. These fragments are what emerged. And so tonight I'll read you 4 different fragments that I've translated. Capítulo 152, chapter 152. And he, Cuauhtémoc, ordered a horn to be sounded, that when heard by his captains and his warriors was a signal, that they must fight in a new way, that they must fall upon us, that they must overcome us or die trying. The sound echoed deep within our ears, the sound resounded deep in our heads, and when they heard it, his squadrons and his companies knew, then or never. The fury and the force they gathered in order to defeat us, I tell you, it's as if, as soon as they heard it, his troops and his companies became aware the moment was now. Such rage and such power they summoned against us. I'm telling you, even now, I am seeing it and am there in that trance. It's like right now, I see it and am there in that now I see it and am again there in that daze, that war. Capítulo 157, chapter 157. And so while Cortés was in Coyoacán, staying in these places with whitewashed walls that could be written upon with charcoal or some sort of ink. He would wake every morning to read the writing on the wall. There were many slurs, some in prose and some in verse, some malicious in the tone of farce. There was writing that said that the sun and the moon and the sky and the stars and the sea and the land have their paths. And even if at any time they deviate from the inclination for which they were created, even if they stray beyond, exceed, escape its delineations, they will still return to their original state. They will still return to their original being. There was writing that said that this is the way it is with the ambition and command of Cortez, that it will come to pass that he will become again who he always was. There was writing that said it had to happen, this return, a return to his primary nature, a return to his first incarnation, a return to him who he first was. Capítulo 156, chapter 156. It rained and flashed and thundered that afternoon until the middle of the night, with so much more water than ever before. And once it was known Cuauhtémoc had been overcome, we soldiers were left as deaf as if we had been men standing within a bell tower where many bells were ringing in that very instant when what had been ringing ceased to ring, when what had been singing ceased to sing. And this I say specifically because for the entirety of the 93 days we were in that city, night and day the Mexican captains were yelling and shouting, warning the squadrons and warriors who were set to battle on the arteries, others calling to those in canoes who were to fight with the ships and those of us on the bridges, others hammering, sinking in sharpened palisades, making fortifications, and opening and deepening the waterways, others preparing lances and arrows, and the women rounding stones to hurl with slings. And so, from the adoratories and towers to their idols, those fucking drums and horns, those painful tall drums, never ceased to sound. And so, by night and by day, we were held in this great sound. So we didn't hear one another, so that one could not hear the others. And after we made Cuauhtémoc a prisoner, the screams ceased, and all noise. This is why I said before, it was as if we had been within a bell tower. This is why I said before, what had been ringing ceased to ring. What had been singing ceased to sing. And now I'm going to read a slightly longer section, chapter. Capítulo 99, chapter 99. I tell you this story because even when he was imprisoned, they trembled before him, because for him they would pick a flying bird from out of the sky. Montezuma knew when the ships were built and floated out on the water, launched with their riggings and masts, their royal banners and their imperial flags, and filled with men who proved their skill with oar and sail. And because he knew, he told Cortez he wished to go and hunt on a certain isolated island of rock out in the lake, an island that no one dared to set foot upon, no matter how powerful they might be, upon pain of death. And Cortez told Montezuma he was welcome to go, but not to forget what he had told him when he went to visit his idols before, that his life was worth less than, that his life was not worth more than any trouble he might cause. But sure, he could go in those ships. The journey would certainly be better in them than in his own canoes or flat-bottom boats, however big they might be. Montezuma was elated to fly away, to depart on the fastest of the vessels, accompanied by several of his lords and chiefs, and on the other ship went many caciques, local chiefs, and one of his sons, and he directed his huntsmen to follow in the canoes and shallow boats. But Cortés also sent Juan Velázquez de León, captain of the guards, Pedro de Alvarado, Cristóbal de Olid, and Alonso de Ávila, along with 200 soldiers. And all of these men very much aware of the quarry they had been given. They watched Montezuma. All of these captains I named were so riled they saw red, their blood was stirred, their feathers were ruffled. When the soldiers were taken aboard, along with 4 bronze cannon and all the powder we had, and our artillerymen who were called Mesa and Arvenga, all together they built, on account of the season, an enclosure, inside of which perched Montezuma with his chieftains. Now a fresh wind began to blow, and the sailors, to amuse themselves, amazed and delighted Montezuma by working the sails so finely that they all flew. And the canoes, which held his huntsmen and the rest of his men, fell behind, despite all of the rowers they carried. Montezuma grew light-hearted. He deemed it masterful, this harmony. And when they arrived at the Peñol, that rock outcropping, which was not far, and he had killed all his prey, the deer and hares, and returned content to the city. And when we drew close to Mexico, Pedro de Alvarado and Juan Velázquez de León and all the other captains were ordered to fire the cannon, which thrilled Montezuma. And when we saw him so honest and fair, so direct and kind, we felt towards him the fealty possessed by kings of those parts, and he treated us as equals. If I were to tell you all the instances and all the ways that he was revered, and the devotion and service that all the lords of New Spain and other provinces gave him, it would be never-ending. I would never end. I would still be talking. I would go on forever, because there was nothing Montezuma wished for that was not brought to him, even if it was a thing with wings, even if it was a thing that flew. A thing that flew, I say, because another day, a group of us, 3 captains and some soldiers, were with the great Montezuma, when suddenly a hawk swooped down through those halls, wide as passageways, to catch a quail, because about the houses and palaces where Montezuma was kept, there were many tame fowl, bred by the Indian mayordomo, charged with sweeping out the inner chambers. And our captains watched as the hawk dove and made its capture, and one of these men, called Francisco de Saucedo the Elegant, said, "Oh, that hawk, how wonderfully he kills, how beautiful his flight." And the rest of us soldiers responded that the hawk was indeed wonderful, and that there were many such birds in these lands for falconing. Montezuma watched us while we twittered. He asked his page, Orteguilla, what we were saying. And his page responded with the words of the captains, how that hawk, who had just flown by on the hunt, was so fine, that if we only had such a one, we would teach it to come to the hand, and out in open fields, whatever we set it upon, even if it were powerful, it would kill for us. So Montezuma said, "Then I will send for the hawk to be captured right now, and we will see if indeed you can break it. And all of us who were there removed our helmets at this benevolence. And he ordered his falconers to be summoned, and he told them to bring him that hawk. And such skill they put into its capture, that by the hour of reciting the Ave Maria, they returned with that very same hawk, and they gave it to Francisco de Salcedo, and he showed it the lure. A translator's note. A lure is an apparatus used by falconers to recall and feed their birds. It is a means by which the captured bird can regain a sense of agency, while all the while remaining a tool of the falconer. But because later other things occurred that are more important than this quest, I will cease to speak of this. Though I told you this story not only because he was such a great prince, who drew tribute from all parts of New Spain and dominated many lands, but because in all places he was so completely obeyed that even when he was a prisoner, his vassals trembled at the sight of him, so much so that for him they seized even the birds flying through the air. But let's look away. Let's leave this behind. Let's put this aside. Let's note together how the wheel of bad fortune turns, also above us, in the air, like a bird. Let's say in unison, once again it approaches, it circles back around, it rolls towards us. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Chloe. Wow, that was very powerful. And so now we will have our second reader. In poetry, music, and storytelling, Trevino brings plenty, captures the humor, sadness, and joy of contemporary Indian life. A Lakota Sioux born on the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota, Trevino lives, writes, teaches, and performs in Portland and has been featured at readings and festivals as far away as Amman, Jordan, and as nearby as Portland's Woodstock Festival. His books include Ghost River, Real Indian Junk Jewelry, and Shedding Skins. His works explore the vibrant dimensions of Indian experience, especially in urban America. So welcome, Trevino.
Thank you for the introduction. Yes, it's great to be here. Since we are still in the pandemic and we are doing this virtually, there's, this is, I guess, hinted at this would be the last time and then go live again. So the experience has, been interesting. I taught classes during the pandemic and it's been virtual. And a lot of that has been some classes, it's okay to have the camera out. The students can have their cameras off. So that was kind of strange on my side to see a bunch of blank squares in our Zoom sessions, and having folks just listen in and maybe sometimes chat in the comment section. But I had to switch over to my lecturing to think about podcasting. So, my undergrad, I did have a radio show with the Portland State University's KPSU, and it was a Saturday program where my format was local poets and local bands. And so we had folks come in, or for the most part, try to have folks live in the studio, and sometimes just spinning records and what have you. But yeah, so I think about, maybe that prepared me for this kind of setup. On top of that, folks talk about Zoom fatigue or internet fatigue or being in front of a screen. My counter to that is, since I was a kid, I played video games. I spent hours in front of the screen, and so for me, I was prepared to be in front of the screen. That kind of training. Take all the skills and abilities that you learn throughout your life, and somehow they can become useful later on. So I felt comfortable with that, being in front of the screen. So that the fatigue that folks felt, I didn't have that. And so, but during that time, because we were remote, and we were able to be remote, I put my offices in my basement, so I'm competing with the furnace behind me. Right now we have central air going, so I have that back here, which means in the basement it's much cooler than in the house. That's why I'm wearing a sweater, which is it's a soft flex for folks who are right now in Portland dealing with the heat wave that's happening. These are first world problems, so it's okay. So yeah, Minikoji Lakota. I'm enrolled in Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. I've been in the Portland area since 1991. Before that, in California, the Bay Area, and then I was born on my reservation in a small Indian Health Services clinic. So I think about that, the reservation-born, urban-grown, that experience and these ideas. And so as I was going through my MFA program. I started a new job. I started an MFA program. Just had a kid, and so these three huge life-changing things that were happening. We didn't move, so that would have been another highly intense time. But during that time, as part of the program, I started thinking about, as a poet's life, there are tracks or sequences that come through, and and these are things that can happen throughout the lifespan of a poet. You have extended sequences that keep popping up, or images or ideas that keep popping up. And so for me, it was looking back at childhood, and that experience, or drawing from some kind of sensory experience, memory, and what I can do to trigger some of that too. So that required me to listen to 80s pop music, and you get a sensation, a fragment of some place or an image, and start writing on that as quickly as possible, because my writing process is pretty quick for the most part. Like, I have a pretty low attention span, so that's why I stick with poetry, not long form like novels or short stories. So short stories are okay, but mostly poetry. So in those small fragments, I start piecing these objects together, these ideas, these scenes, and so I started putting that into my manuscript and start processing that. And I'm still in the process of doing that. I've been sitting on this manuscript right now for maybe 5 years, and I think it's getting there. But now that I have a little bit of time, I can start to think about like continued revision process. The work of an artist, the work of a poet is, a project is never really finished. A poem's never really finished. You just abandon it and move on. So I feel like that needs to happen with this collection. I was toying with the idea originally, small hand field, but that seemed a bit too academic, thinking about the field of poetry and how pretty vast it is. And, if I'm thinking about childhood or childhood experiences, that's why I had the small hand, and what the small hand sees of itself in relation to the world around them, from that perspective, and, from that interpretation of what's happening there. And of course, within the manuscript, it goes back and forth between me as a narrator, adult looking at things, and then as a child just viewing things. So it goes back and forth, and in the processes. So the first poem's called Yard. I sip music, cheeked a melody. My hand pinches feather braid into a sepia image replica. Plucked moonlight spills onto the HUD house back porch. Red noon wind twitches, grasshopper jump, legs bow songs. Shingle seams rooftops. I drift to paper plates, chips, hot dog, white cups, 2-liter containers near empty, dark pool sockets, flat and sugary. An aluminum framed woven lawn chair, dentures in a clear cup on fold out table, seated on dried mud caked surface, cracks fissure across driveway cement slabs. My brown fingers pinch and insert penny candy into my sweet scented mouth, a brown bag near empty on my lap, torn screen flailing from a cardboard window. Big city rock music pushes dust under street lamp. I chase a napkin off a blanket, watch it sail across the neighbor's yard. So some of the ideas with that, I have this image of this, said with family and grandparents in the backyard having a picnic. So some of those images that just pop out. And of course, there in South Dakota, no one really has fences. So like kind of just an open yard and things float around and fall off. So started thinking about those images that are happening there as much as I can. You know, the rest is invention too, of course. And, you know, trying to capture, how do you capture a time period? What are the hints that you put in there? So for me, the hint is, and thinking about like in the early 80s, getting $1 to get penny candy, 100 pieces of candy, that was amazing. So we think about inflation at that time too, right? Like, and the idea of penny candy, and, you know, as one potential through line that can happen is, you know, like inflation that happens there. Penny candy turns into 5-cent candy, 10 cents, 20 cents, and so forth. Or 25 cents. And so, you know, thinking about those little aspects that as a child, you know, you just hopefully have access to certain things. And that was one thing I thought about. And I still get some ideas of what that may mean as well. Like, I remember as a kid, just dropping candy, these penny candy, if I wasn't able to finish it or whatever, it fell on the floor or accidentally drop it, ants would cover it. You know, I still have candy now as an adult, and I have dropped candy as well, and ants don't go for the candy. And if there's some kind of indication of where we are right now, of like even on that level of this relationship that we have as humans to our continued surroundings, the penny candy itself and that relationship that we have to non-human things, you know, starts to change as well. So I don't know if folks are noticing, but I'm kind of I think too much on stuff. But I often have that as a poet, you know, part of the writing is ruminating on stuff and finding connections and the interconnectedness of things and how they're in relationship through history and time, what have you. Next poem's called Room. Tin cans on peel on the countertop, corned beef hash grease stain, a steel spoon. Pool tabs shine in the corner pile discard. Liver our lives. Diapers flower near the dumpster, colon expression. Bag secure, molding loaf ends. Spread potted meat on bread slice. Tennis shoes curl at entry. One jabbed, open door. Mesh hat soiled sweat rim. Kitchen table edge hook. Jean shorts woven with tube socks. A weight wear cycle. Oh, at that eye level of a kid, how your relationship to a table is, right? It could be a danger point for getting your head smacked on if you're not too careful. So there's think about that perspective, and you know, the imagination of re-entering that space of childhood and HUD house there in South Dakota, what that may mean, and that in itself becomes, you know, metaphor for, you know, a people that do the best they can to live within shared living space, small shared living space. But as a kid, you don't realize how tiny these spaces are until you go back and revisit these homes and see like, oh yeah, these rooms are really tiny. This house is pretty small. I had that experience going back and visiting family members, in California, which the house always was. I thought as a kid it was a good size. They go back, you're adult, you're much bigger, and you're used to other surroundings. You go back and realize, wow, that place is pretty small. My memory has enlarged the space from where it is right now as I engage with it. And I think about language on this level too. So tennis shoes, I hear, in grabbing images, objects, language, I hear other people saying it like how they say it. And so tennis shoes or tennis shoes. So I have to play around with that. Like, how do folks say this? I mean, these things these objects, these names are regional. So it would be sneakers or trainers in other places or other countries, tennis shoes. Are they actually made for tennis? So I start asking these questions, like when these words come out from reflection, from memory, from other people saying it around me, and they enter into the poem itself, I started thinking about like what's going on there. Like, or how do this is part of the revision process of how do I allude to a speaker's sense of language and purpose that they have with that language and expressing objects around them. So for me, that becomes interesting interrogation into the work itself. So in this poem too, thinking about pool tabs, shine, in the corner pile, discard. Pool tabs, that's definitely of a generation where their 12-ounce aluminum cans had pool tabs. Those kind of relationships that happen there. So for me, the image, throwing a bunch of cans or pull tabs from whatever happened is interesting. These are strange, interesting, peculiar details that, in the language set within the context of its time period, turn into something else for me. And that may or may not be explicit for a generation who didn't grow up with that. So I have to think about that and how do I enter a poem into a space of timelessness, which may or may not be possible, but things are of a time, so I'm okay with that as well. Of course, thinking about poor people food, right? So growing up on commodity food or potted meat, like that, I find interesting. Next poem's called Burnt Plastic Men. A plastic Boba Fett in my mouth, I chew hands to a deformed reach. The mauled plastic racetrack threads through my belt loops. I lean into seat, push pedals, dirt sprays eyes. I grip the big wheel handles, the tassels whip at the air. Sidewalk to street ride, fly onto the black asphalt, no safety caution. Pop out action figure from pocket, position toy on hardened mound, lighter ignites meltdown. So again, the image for me is, as a kid having these big wheel bikes, and the idea of like you're going from the strange right now, like going from the sidewalk onto the street without even looking if there's cars are coming. And so some of this interrogation or investigation into the time period, as a parent, I'm not sure if it's like helicopter parenting or whatnot, but I can't imagine not supervising my kid doing that stuff or letting them go and roam, the reservation with a bunch of other kids and doing whatever they want to do unsupervised. And then, I'm thinking that at this time, like being 5 years old, these things are happening, or 4 or 5 around there. But different times, The other side of that too, being in a small community there, where you have your extended relative kinship networks, so everyone looks out for everyone else. So I think that adds to a dynamic of that kind of safety for children. The more academic title of Small Hand Field, I like it, but for me, what I start to think about is the title of which I'm working with now is called Gift Kid, so like a gift and then kid, and for me that's this concept, the Lakota concept of children are gifts, Wakankija, or Wakakija, sacred gifts. And the idea is, you create a space for kids that they feel safe, because children, in Lakota philosophy, spiritual practices, they can leave this world. And so you want to create an environment where they want to stay around. And so this idea of kids being a gift has a different approach to parenting, and those kind of models of like, how do you respect a child and their understanding of the world around them, or create an environment that is appropriate for them to be safe, to learn, explore. I think about that with training in positive Indian parenting, like making space appropriate for the age of the children, what that looks like. And so making sure they're safe, and also for as a parent not to be frustrated by things that you don't want being broken, or whatever with your own objects. So Gift Kid for me, and the sound of it too, as a poet, I think sonically, like, that's part of my side of it as a musician too. I'm like, sometimes it doesn't have to make sense. I just like the sound, and the sound is good enough, and I'm not too concerned about what makes sense, or even syntax or anything like that. Just let it flow out and enjoy the sonic quality of a poem. And those, as a poet, in certain kind of poetry, there's different registers that can be activated. And so I'm thinking about those hierarchy of registers that can be activated, and thinking about through lines and the connectivity between poems and a manuscript and images linked together. And so those other registers activated, hopefully in creating and revising poetry, I can, understand what those are and tweak them the way I want to be tweaked. Next poem is called Through the Field. Sunflowers yellow the field, slow dusk skyline bleed. My mother's small body struggles to kick over the truck ignition. She prostrates against bench seat, pressing the clutch. Stalled in the road's shoulder, gas gone, we wait for refill. Clear pop bottles pinwheel out the window. Gray smoke puff from rusted muffler. Cloud thrust in rear view. Splintered side mirror. Green bales burst from the hill. She punches the cracked dashboard. Fueled truck roars alive. Mono stereo creases the wind. My hand slices horizon gleam. Highway stapled to the prairie. Thinking about the as prairie people and prairie relationships, and those extended networks, going back home, that even at the point of running out of fuel, and you have to driving somewhere is like 30-40 minutes to go anywhere. So support or help, assistance on the side of the road when cars are stalled. It was interesting when I went back home to see people, like, if someone's distressed on the side of the road, you pull over and check in on them. And being in the city, you try to avoid other people unless you know them or have seen them around, or they're familiar in some way. And then that experience between rural and urban settings are, I think, really interesting. But then also the element of these are extended family relationships, your relatives. That someone is related to someone else, who's related to someone else through family lines, which in some ways, I guess, in Portland, there's like at least 2 degrees of separation, that you would know someone who would know someone else who, so there's kinship networks that are either through the genealogical relationships or ancestry relationships, or kinship networks that are within societal connections that happened. and as you can tell, I like talking about this stuff about poetry, not just reading the poetry all the way through. That's my thing. Then that for me is like, people can read the manuscript themselves or read the poetry in itself, but when I add some other element on there, that the live, or in this case, live now, but review later situation with this reading event, can add more onto the work itself, which is, that's something that I wanted to see or read about or engage with when I read about other poets and their work, or I was the type of person at the time when we watch DVDs is I would go back and watch the DVD with directed commentary, which was really annoying for everyone else who didn't like that. But for me, it was fascinating because I'm all about like process, like how does this happen? So I think we're getting close. So try to do 2 more poems. Porch. Quote, dust cakes bare feet. The cement porch houses a dog den. Open window and a child slouches into night. The urine-soaked bedding turned over. 3 cousins in wet sleepwear. The HUD house creaks with the wind gusts. A metal pole clank measures the cricket's howls. End quote. End quote. Summer barefoot cut-off jeans, shorts, and tank top. My family's home rests on a hill in Sesame Street. Neighborhood kids at our place race bikes. Some ride plastic 3-wheeled bikes known as big wheels. Everyone's favorite roaming res pack dog present. Mine, all white, births a litter. Dog dug a den under our back porch. We blast Thriller out our window long into the night. My 2 cousins and I share a single bed. The older one woke the younger one to use the bathroom. Some nights, the older one slept through his routine. The younger one would wet the bed. I listened to the wind outside before I sleep. It moves the whole house with the other night noises. Air horn at dusk. Grasshoppers drone dim in the grass swaying swoosh. Car revving pinned a loud rock music thump. I was playing with the idea of like a quote and like response to that, or expanding a quote. So for me, that was first draft, or somewhere near the first drafts, where it's just like concise wording and like how do I take that concise wording and expand it into a different kind of narrative. So to me, that'd be. I was reminiscing that idea with Simon Ortiz books on what's it called? On Sand Creek, where there one side was a quotation, I think on the verso, and then on the recto page, it was the verse next to that. So this idea of this engagement between the pages that's happening there. That would be the next step for the manuscript, is how is it going to be laid out in the book itself? How does it engage with each poem? I'm thinking that about the arrangement overall, but when it's actually, some of the test printing, like how does that work? So I have to be aware of that. Try to find a shorter one. All right, this will be my last poem. Yard. The cottonwood knuckles, sky-torn cranes, neck roots through bone marrow tubes, frayed end against wind currents. Our fenced-in backyard, cottonwood tree narration. A tire swing dangles from chunky limb. Out my bedroom window, bare branches cut powder sky. Bunched crane legs, beaks slicing air. I overlay my finger bend to the tree outline. So again, that for me, that continue that experiment of like, what if we had a tercet there, concise tercet, and then like expand it from that. And for me, like a theme that runs through is like looking at hands, because to me, with my son, see like a small hand, like this, it's amazing. And then compare that with mine, and like this relationship that memory may have to measuring things around you with your hand. Of course, that might lead into other ways how folks may measure things around them. So I thought that was interesting. So yeah, thank you everyone for having me, and hopefully got some good images and enjoyment out of the work.
Trevino, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you both.
Wow. Well, it's a whole world.
Yeah, we've been in
Yeah.
a couple of worlds.
Yeah.
We do have, no one has emailed me, which is not unusual. But we do have a couple questions, one for each author from Henry Alley. The first one is for Chloe. Henry asks, how do you see Montezuma as a tragic figure? The prose creates a sense of majesty.
Well, there is a sense of majesty, for sure, and power in the text. But what I'm really trying to do with the project is to get down into the word level and see what is being said through the word choices, and absolutely make room for that and not impose my own reading of the history, but to look at the points in the text where it seems like something is being said that's not being said, and get into that. And Montezuma and his story and his presence in the text is always a point of something not being said that's not being said. And so there's a lot of different fragments that I'm just trying to see what's going on with the word choice or the way that something is being described, and then bring that ambiguity to you, the reader, so that we can inhabit that space.
No, that's really great. To me, it touches upon etymology, so like the study of origins of words. So if you're doing translation, like every word has its own story and origin, definition, history behind it. That I applaud people who do translations, because you're putting in the context, you're translating even the world view for a different audience to kind of get those cues. And we really see this with metaphors or similes when that happens, like what, or even I think about it in Spanish, what chickens say cluck is different than in English.
Yeah.
And so like those cultural aspects are really, really fascinating. And of course, you're, as the translator, the genius of the translation is making sure those different societies can actually get to the substance or the context of what's being said.
Yeah. I mean, I call these renderings because they're not exactly straight on translations. I'm a poet and a translator, and this project to me seemed like a point where I could become both at the same time. All of the language is completely translated, but the form that I'm using in these texts is manipulated so as to give you the ambiguity, or restate something so that we can kind of inhabit the space that's in the text a little bit more.
That's great.
Henry also asked a question of you, Trevino. He says, you have a large and interesting range of images. How do you determine whether a poem should be set to music?
Yeah, I remember I used to do gigs where I'll read poetry and singer-songwriter do songs as well. That is a lot of energy. Imagine just being nervous and anxious and stressed out just doing a reading, or even just a music performance. Now you multiply that together. So I kind of put that away and be okay just to focus in on one discipline for events. And so I have a hard time writing lyrics, which is strange, right? So I write poetry, I have no problems, issues, and maybe that's just the axis of, or the process of practice, right? So with that, I had the idea of, like, in the aughts, I wanted to, I always have like these big plans, or I don't know if projects or ego or whatever, but I wanted to do a box set, a 10 CD box set. And so I said, all right, well, I'm going 1 week time. I'm going to write 10 songs, record them, and then mix them, and then be done. And then, take a little bit of time and keep going. So I was able to get to album 8 through that process. But through that process I didn't care that much how the lyrics needed to be refined. And that was such a relief. And so for that, they the music in lyrics, the music lifts a lot. You can get by with really poorly written lyrics if the music's great, right? Or the other way around, can add more onto it, another dimension to that. So I was able to, just at least in that project, that aspect, to be okay with that process. But to write verse poetry first and then try to put music behind it, I think that'd be pretty challenging, unless I do like have to commit time to it and do like libretto work or whatever that is for opera or musicals. Switch off the ego and just go into work mode, right?
It's interesting to think about, because I wrote down that you talked about the connection between memory and measuring, and then thinking of measure in the musical sense, and what the connection was. I loved all of the way that you kept bringing us back to these time markers and these measurements, and pointing out these moments that situate you in a place where you actually aren't in a time when you weren't situated. That was really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, if I'm trying, it's funny that I'm writing period pieces, even though I loathe period piece movies, right? But even science fiction may be considered a period piece movie within the time now, or even a speculative future that may be there. So, my relationship with time is always constantly there. And, as I age, things change, things go away, develop, and all that. And, memory is the most failing thing that are, I was listening to a radio podcast. I forgot which one it was, but they talk about memory as the mind reinvents it every time. It's not like a hard drive, you can just access it, but the mind reinvents it every time. So details change. And so even in the process of excavating memory, images, whatever, it's not going to be as precise as what it was at the time. And even that memory of a child is flawed from, talking with relatives at that time. So like, even though we were poor, even all these other things that were going on, they still provided food for folks. Like kids kids had access to food. And I'm thinking about that now, like that's pretty amazing. But as a kid, you're not that critical or understanding of these other things. That makes sense because, as a kid, you're only concrete thinker until you're later able to do abstract thinking and make those connections.
You both are such profoundly contextual writers. I mean, Chloe in these translations, and Trevino in the poems. I mean, and I was thinking about, Trevino with your poetry, the images, but the images involving all the senses, much beyond visual. I mean, including visual, but the textures of the context that you're bringing in. There's the powder sky. There's and the legs of the cranes. There's the sense of the textures of the text of what you're doing, and Chloe, the emotional textures are extraordinary. The rendering of the fog of war. I mean, the trance, the daze, the PTSD feeling that you bring with redundancy, repetition. There's just, but also that hawk. There's a great deal of rich imagery too. I mean, I know the text, and I think what you're doing through your abuelo.
Mhm.
It's really, really amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Cool.
my master's program is at Institute of American Indian Arts, and all the poets that came out of there, they're amazing. So I was lucky at that moment to work with all these poets who were influenced by author Z. The
Yeah.
focus heavy on images, and for me that carries through with no matter sentiment that's there. The images, as long as it's able to resonate, that stays with people. And so I kind of lean more into that side, and then of course make allowances around that.
That's funny. Arthur is definitely a mentor of mine too.
Yeah, it's amazing.
He's amazing. Yeah.
See, there's a reason that you're both here.
Well, it's a small world, right? Small
Yeah.
poets as well.
Yeah.
Well, I've looked into my email. There are no other questions or on chat, but does anybody have anything else you'd like to say before we close out the evening?
I'm good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your readings and your beautiful imagery. This has been such a lovely windfall. And thank you also to Amanda and Diane for your hosting and your wonderful introductions and your warm selves. Thank you so much for all you've done for Windfall. It was wonderful to have you this past year.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Trevino and Chloe.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all so much. We'll reconvene in September live at the library and streaming the live events. So please do tune in, have your questions ready, and enjoy the rest of your summers. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you in a few months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.